There's a barn outside Hicksville, Ohio, where a 1948 Ford 8N still starts on the first pull. The paint has faded to a rust-flecked orange red. Ford calls it Ford Red, but the old-timers who ran these fields called it something else, because for 8 years before this tractor existed, that same red belonged to a different name entirely: Ferguson. The man whose name once sat where Ford now sits died believing the company he helped build a fortune had stolen his life's work in broad daylight. The barn is still there. The tractor is still there. The man is not, and the company that bears his name today survives only as a footnote stitched into somebody else's brand. This is the story of Harry Ferguson, the Irish mechanic who taught the tractor how to think, and the handshake that Henry Ford's grandson broke without ever writing down why.
Harry Ferguson was born in 1884 in Growell, County Down, in what was then Ireland's rural north, the son of a farmer who wanted him to stay a farmer. He didn't. Ferguson spent the 1920s and 1930s obsessed with a single unsolved problem. When a plow hit a rock or a rut, the tractor pulling it would rear up, sometimes flipping backward onto the driver. Men died this way. Ferguson's answer was the three-point linkage, a hitch system that used hydraulic draft control to let the tractor and implement move as one connected body, sensing resistance and adjusting automatically. It sounds small. It reshaped agriculture. By 1936, working with English manufacturer David Brown, Ferguson had it in production. But Ferguson didn't just want to build a good hitch. He wanted a manufacturing partner big enough to put it on every farm in North America. In October of 1938, he found one. Ferguson brought his system to Dearborn, Michigan, and demonstrated it personally to Henry Ford, the most famous industrialist alive, a man who had already put the world on wheels with the Model T and had tried, with mixed success, to put it on tractors with the Fordson 2 decades earlier. Ford watched Ferguson's system lift and lower a plow with uncanny precision, and the two men shook hands. No contract, no lawyers, just a spoken agreement, witnessed by almost no one. Ford would manufacture the tractor, Ferguson would design it, supply the implements, and handle distribution. Profits would be split on trust alone. It is worth sitting with how strange that arrangement already was by 1938 standards. Ford Motor Company was, even then, one of the largest industrial enterprises on the planet, run by a founder famous for controlling every detail of every deal he made. Ferguson was an outsider, Irish, self-taught, with no American manufacturing base of his own. Walking away from a meeting with nothing but a spoken promise and a working prototype. Almost everyone around both men, including Ford's own executives, thought it was reckless. For 8 years, it wasn't. Out of that handshake came the Ford Ferguson 9N in 1939, a compact 28-horsepower tractor that combined the three-point hitch with a live power takeoff in a package small farmers could actually afford. It was, by any honest measure, a revolution. A farmer who had been wrestling a plow by feel and muscle now had a machine that did the sensing for him. The 9N sold by the tens of thousands. A slightly revised wartime version, the 2N, followed in 1942, when steel shortages forced compromises like magneto ignition and steel wheels. Between the two models, Ford built more than 300,000 tractors, carrying Ferguson's invention inside a Ford badge. For 8 years, it worked. Ferguson made money. Ford made money. Farmers got a machine that changed how row crop agriculture was done in America. The handshake held. What happened next was the betrayal that every implement dealer between Dearborn and Des Moines would later describe the same way. Not as a business dispute, but as a death in the family that nobody was allowed to grieve properly, because it happened in a boardroom instead of a farmhouse. Henry Ford died in April of 1947. His grandson, Henry Ford II, had already taken control of the company 2 years earlier, inheriting a business that the war and his aging grandfather's erratic leadership had left in real financial trouble. The new Ford wanted more control over the tractor line than a handshake with an aging Irish inventor allowed.
Negotiations to formalize the arrangement in writing went nowhere. Accounts differ on exactly why, but the outcome didn't. On June 30, 1947, Henry Ford II ended the agreement his grandfather had made. Not renegotiated it, ended it. Ferguson, who had built his entire North American tractor business on the assumption that the man's word was the contract, was simply informed that the arrangement was over. Then came the part that turned a business breakup into a lawsuit that would be called the largest in corporate history up to that time. Ford didn't stop building the tractor. In 1947, the company launched the 8N, an updated, four-speed successor to the 9N and 2N, and it still used a version of Ferguson's three-point hitch, his hydraulic draft control, his power takeoff design. The patents on almost none of it had expired. Ford had walked away from the man, but kept the invention. Ferguson was left in his own country's biggest agricultural market, with no tractor of his own to sell, and a competitor selling his own engineering under a name that wasn't his. He answered the only way a man in his position could. In 1948, Harry Ferguson filed suit against the Ford Motor Company, its subsidiary Dearborn Motors, and Henry Ford II personally. An antitrust and patent infringement claim seeking $251 million, a figure so large for its era that Time magazine called it, without much exaggeration, one for the record books. Ferguson accused Ford of monopolizing the tractor trade and of deliberately, mechanically copying his patented system component by component to build the 8N. To understand why $251 million wasn't simply a number pulled from the air, you have to understand what Ferguson believed he'd actually lost. It wasn't just 8 years of royalties on a tractor Ford no longer had to share. It was the entire North American distribution network he'd built around the assumption that Ford's factories would keep supplying him product indefinitely. Dealers, parts warehouses, implement contracts, all of it built on a foundation that had just been pulled out from under him with 60 days' notice. Ferguson's lawyers argued that Ford hadn't just broken a promise. It had used the trust built during those 8 years to study, copy, and then discard the man who taught them the system in the first place. Whether a court would ever agree with a number that large was, from the start, almost beside the point. The lawsuit was as much a public reckoning as it was a legal claim, a way of making sure the record showed, in Ferguson's own words, exactly what had been done to him.
There is a filing in that case, buried in 10,000 pages of trial testimony taken over more than a year in a Manhattan federal courtroom, that tells you exactly how much this fight cost both men before a single dollar of settlement ever changed hands. Ford's own lawyers later estimated the company spent over $3 million just getting the case to trial. Ferguson Inc. spent roughly the same amount, matching them page for page, deposition for deposition.
While it's easy from today's distance to imagine the underdog Irishman going up against the industrial giant, the courtroom reality was more complicated. Ferguson's antitrust claim that Ford was illegally monopolizing the tractor business collapsed under its own weight. His company's sales figures actually undercut the argument. Ferguson Inc. posted $64.5 million in 1951, down from a $79.4 million peak reached while Ford was still building the tractor for him, but hardly evidence of a market Ford had strangled. The court dismissed the antitrust portion of the case outright. What survived, and what mattered, was the patent infringement claim. And on that ground, Ford didn't have a defense worth taking to a jury. In April of 1952, after 4 years of litigation, the two sides settled out of court. Ford agreed to pay Harry Ferguson $9.25 million, not the $251 million he had sued for, but still, at the time, the largest patent infringement settlement ever paid in an American courtroom. As part of the deal, Ford formally admitted it had infringed Ferguson's patents on the hydraulic valve, the coupling system, and the power takeoff, and agreed to pay Ferguson roughly $21 for every one of the 441,000 8N series tractors Dearborn Motors had built since mid-1947. Well short of the $100 per tractor Ferguson had originally demanded, but an admission of guilt no amount of Ford public relations could undo. The court, however, made one more decision that mattered more in the long run than the settlement check. It refused to renew Ferguson's expiring patents, ruling that his three-point hitch system was now too fundamental to modern agriculture to remain the property of one company. By 1952, most of the important Ferguson patents had lapsed anyway. The ruling simply made it official. Every tractor manufacturer on Earth was now free to use the invention that had once been Harry Ferguson's alone. Massey Harris used it, International Harvester used it. Every red, green, and orange tractor built from that decade forward carried somewhere in its hydraulics a piece of a system one man in County Down had spent 15 years perfecting, and none of them owed him a cent for it anymore. The settlement money itself tells its own quiet story about what 4 years of fighting Ford actually cost Harry Ferguson. Of the $9.25 million awarded, roughly half was consumed by his own legal fees before he ever saw it. A payout that, adjusted honestly against what he'd sued for and what the fight had taken out of him, looked less like victory and more like survival. Contemporaries who knew him in those years described a man whose health had visibly deteriorated under the weight of the litigation, the stress of a legal war fought not against a stranger, but against the family of a man he had once shaken hands with in good faith. It's worth remembering the broader climate this fight unfolded in. Post-war America was flooding its farms with mechanization at a pace no decade before it had matched. Returning veterans, expanding acreage, and cheap credit drove tractor demand to levels the industry had never seen. That boom is exactly why the Ford-Ferguson fight mattered so much to onlookers at the time. Two companies were fighting over who would own the core technology sitting at the center of the biggest mechanization wave in American farming history. Losing that fight, for Ferguson, didn't just mean losing a lawsuit. It meant losing his foothold in the fastest-growing tractor market on Earth at precisely the moment it was growing fastest. While Ford, cushioned by its size and its other product lines, could absorb a $9.25 million settlement as a rounding error and move on to the Golden Jubilee anniversary tractor within a year. Ferguson never got his tractor business back to where it had been before June 1947. Cut off from Ford's manufacturing capacity, he'd been forced to import tractors built at his own Banner Lane plant in Coventry, England, the TE20, the Little Grey Fergie, which had begun production in 1946 as insurance against exactly the kind of betrayal that had now happened. More than 500,000 TE20s would eventually roll out of Banner Lane by 1956, and a U.S. market version, the TO20, arrived in 1948 to try to fill the hole Ford had left. But Ferguson Inc. was fighting on two fronts, building tractors and fighting Ford in court, and neither business ever fully recovered its footing as an independent American concern. By 1953, the math had become unavoidable. Massey Harris, the large Canadian agricultural manufacturer, acquired the entire Ferguson tractor and machinery operation for $16.25 million in Massey Harris stock. The company became Massey Harris Ferguson, then simply Massey Ferguson, a name that survives today on machines built by a corporation Harry Ferguson didn't control, using engineering principles he could no longer patent, employing a legacy that had been folded into someone else's brand within 6 years of his lawsuit against Ford. Ferguson resigned as chairman in 1954. He spent his remaining years working restlessly on a four-wheel drive Formula One car that never raced competitively, and he died in 1960, largely out of the tractor business that carried his name into the 21st century without him. The Dearborn plant that built the 8N is, today, still part of Ford's sprawling Michigan manufacturing footprint, though tractor production itself left Ford entirely by the 1960s, spun off and eventually sold. Ford's tractor operations, and later the Ford New Holland brand, would themselves be sold off to Fiat in 1991. One more layer of corporate history stacked on top of a fight that started with two men and a handshake nobody thought to write down. Banner Lane, the Coventry factory Ferguson had built as his insurance policy against exactly this kind of betrayal, kept building tractors under the Massey Ferguson name for decades after Ferguson himself had left the boardroom. A strange kind of vindication, in that the plant outlived the man's control of it by more than 40 years, still turning out red tractors carrying a hitch system he could no longer claim as his own. There's a particular irony that farm historians return to again and again when they tell this story. The very ubiquity of the three-point hitch is what erased Harry Ferguson from most farmers' memory of it. Because the court refused to renew his patents in 1952, and because every manufacturer adopted the system within a decade, an entire generation of farmers grew up believing the three-point hitch was simply how tractors had always worked, the way nobody credits the inventor of the wheel. The invention won completely. The inventor's name did not travel with it. Collector community. Somewhere tonight, in a shed in Licking County, Ohio, or a barn outside Fergus Falls, Minnesota, a name that isn't a coincidence, a Ford 8N or a Ferguson TO20 is getting its hydraulics bled and its points gapped for another season of county fair demonstrations. The Ferguson Club circuit in North America and the UK remains one of the most active pockets of antique tractor collecting anywhere, populated by people who can tell you unprompted exactly which components on their machine trace back to Harry Ferguson's original patents and which ones Ford's engineers redesigned to get around the 1952 settlement. They know the difference between a Ferguson system tractor and a Ford tractor with Ferguson parts, the way a genealogist knows the difference between a direct descendant and a cousin twice removed. The knowledge of exactly where the betrayal lives in the metal survives almost entirely in people like these, because neither Ford nor Massey Ferguson's corporate archives were ever going to tell the story from Harry Ferguson's side.